viewed through the lens of Sufism, which perceives authentic spirituality as that which overcomes the self. The notion of spiritual empowerment, as practiced through smartphones and social media, appear not so spiritual. Welcome to Renovatio's audio essays. Renovatio, published by Zaytuna College, asks writers to examine timeless questions and today's moral challenges by drawing from the enduring texts of revelatory faith traditions, traditional philosophy, and modern scholarship. The following essay is written by Esmé L.K. Partridge. Esmé Partridge is a parliamentary researcher in the UK House of Commons with research interests in Western philosophy and the history of dialogue between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. She is an MPhil graduate from the University of Cambridge. Transcendence and TikTok. Read by Laiba Hussein. What does it mean to manifest something, or for something to become manifest? For those familiar with Islamic mystical terminology, the concept of tajalli may come to mind. Often rendered into English as manifestation, tajalli denotes the appearance or disclosure of the divine names in physical forms. Similar to the notion of theophany in other religious traditions, with the philosopher Henry Corbin taking tajalli to be a synonym of just that. It means passively experiencing God manifesting himself in the world. But manifestation has come to mean something rather different in the realm of contemporary popular spirituality, especially on its digital interfaces. Most prominently, on the social media app TikTok, it refers to a popular trend consisting of supposedly supernatural means of attracting money, good grades, more followers, or even a wholesale dream life. A semantic inversion of tajalli, this kind of manifestation is the pursuit of bringing one's own desires into the world. With over 12 billion views to date, the hashtag manifestation on TikTok offers various methods for turning one's dreams into reality. These range from simple visualization activities to complex rituals such as scribing or scripting, that is, writing out a desired outcome on paper, which is later destroyed, sometimes with the aids of symbols or sigils. The practitioners of these manifestation techniques believe that, with the aid of unseen supernatural forces, the nature of which they seldom explicate, what they seek will become manifested in their lives. Many claim to have yielded, among other things, large sums of money through such techniques, in turn often attracting hundreds of thousands of followers. In one video, for example, a young serial manifester delineates how to scribe as follows. Play pretend and write a journal entry from the perspective of you living your dream life. Go into this as if you have already created all of what you want to create in your life, and how happy and how grateful you are. The performance of manifestation rituals on TikTok usually commences with a stated intention. At first glance, this procedure might appear to resemble another concept within Islam, namely the niyyah, the declaration of one's intention to worship God before commencing daily prayers or pilgrimage. The nature of this intention contrasts sharply with that of the average TikTok manifester, and the difference between the two is telling. While the niyyah signifies a submission of the self to God and His will, the TikTok manifester's intention is a commitment to actualizing one's personal will. The manifester, wishing to be free from the predestined and unpredictable conditions of life, intends to subvert the powers that be, redirecting them toward the end of self-servitude. This sort of manifestation perfectly represents the reign of the nafs, the temperament exhibited by contemporary spirituality, whereby attempts to rekindle a sense of transcendence revolve solely around the ego, or the nafs in the Islamic tradition. The ideological seeds for this spiritual individualism were sown during the Protestant Reformation and the European Enlightenment, were developed through the psychoanalytic movement, and bore fruit in the more recent New Age movement. This genealogy represents the gradual demise of a shared metaphysical aspiration toward the objective in favor of that which is relative and ultimately subjective. Thus, self-manifestation can be thought to mirror the developments of modern and postmodern Western philosophy between the 18th and 20th centuries. These subjective tendencies have been exacerbated by what can be called digital spirituality, the latest wave of the new age that has, thanks to the tidal forces of TikTok algorithms, arrived on the shores of internet subcultures. As the popularity of the manifestation hashtag shows, the defining characteristic of such spirituality is that it is driven by servitude to the ego as well as to personal desires for material possessions and popularity. In light of this, we ought to understand why the digital environment in particular appears to be so conducive to these tendencies, and how the very wiring of technology enables nafs-oriented spirituality. At first glance, social media seems to represent a new phase in the reign of the nafs. After all, the devices hosting it, smartphones, mark the apex of privatized technology, which was itself conceived as a means of liberating the individual from the confines of society, and ultimately reality itself. This technology was, from the very beginning, imbued with quasi-spiritual undertones. The pioneers of cyberculture in the 1980s, such as Timothy Leary and Douglas Rushkoff, embraced the personal computer as a vessel for self-liberation to the point of transcendence. Their project opened the way for an affinity between high-tech and spiritual empowerments. The early cyberpunk culture spawned from their optimism that the PC could facilitate the exploration of boundless new horizons in the virtual realm. As it turned out, the privatization of technology paved the way for something more profane: an intensification of the same individualism that capitalist modernity has always thrived on. Moreover, much like psychoanalysis, privatized technology helped reintroduce notions of transcendence within an egocentric framework. It fed the modern appetite for self-gratification rather than the hunger for transcendence. Social science, through quantitative research, has shown how the personal device both creates and consolidates a sense of worldly self. For the majority of participants in a 2019 study, researchers found that smartphones serve as ontological extensions of the self. In providing an accessible archive of our personal photographs, calendar entries, and other memories, smartphones help craft a coherent narrative encapsulating our temporal life and identity. Far from engendering a transcendent version of the self, as Leary and the other cyberculture pioneers envisioned, smartphones do little more than affirm the self as it exists in the world. Plugging the 2019 study into the current analysis, it seems that smartphones essentially ontologize the nafs. This is especially so with social media, which both bolsters the ego through the desire to be liked and normalizes the submission to the lower self. Carnal hedonism. For example, exposure to advertisements for instant delivery of food and carnal hedonism are commonplace. By normalizing the precedence of the nafs, smartphones and especially social media are fortifying individualism at both the societal and spiritual levels. Manifestation on TikTok, it can be said, represents the convergence of the cultural preoccupation with subjectivity and a New Age emphasis on self-actualization through the use of technologies. This signifies yet another inversion of traditional mysticism, especially that of Islam, which is concerned with quite the opposite of self-actualization. If self can be deemed as referring to the nafs and not the ruh, the spiritual dimension of the human being. Indeed, central to tasawwuf or Sufism is the pursuit of purifying and ultimately overcoming the self. This is encapsulated in the concept of tazkiyah, often translated as purification, and asserted in a Quranic verse regarding the soul. Indeed, he prospers who purifies it, zakkaha, and indeed he fails who obscures it. Surah Shams, verses 9 and 10. The Islamic mystical tradition abounds with literature alluding to tazkiyah and its exegeses. In Sufi poetry, for example, the motif of polishing the mirror, that is, purifying one's internal constitution so it may reflect the light of God, can serve as a metaphor for tazkiyah, since it conveys the mystic's ambition to rectify the impurities inflicted by the lower self and instead embody the divine attributes. Many instances of this path of purification can be found cloaked in the poetic lexicon of Rumi, with others appearing in more practical and prescriptive formats. The 11th century Persian Sufi Khwaja Abdullah Ansari, for example, provided a systematic account of the 100 stages or way stations, al-manazil, through which one must progress to purify the self, beginning with self-awareness and ending with self-annihilation, or fana. Perhaps the richest resources on overcoming the self can be found in the works of the 11th century mystical theologian al-Ghazali. Several passages in his magnum opus, Revival of the Religious Sciences, allude to tazkiyah and the internal struggle against the sensory and appetitive faculties, jihad an-nafs, which constitutes a prerequisite to spiritual purification. According to his account, the self must be disciplined via the development of an equilibrium. Goodness of character proceeds from an equilibrium in the rational faculty brought about through sound wisdom, and in the irascible and appetitive faculties through their submission to the intellect and the law. Some believe that such submission is at the very essence of Sufism. The mystic Ja'far bin Muhammad al-Khuldi, for example, asserted that Sufism is to throw the ego into slavery, emerge from human nature, and gaze wholly upon God. Egocentrism, a defining characteristic of digital spirituality, runs contrary to the Islamic mystical pursuit of tazkiyah. Viewed through the lens of Sufism, which perceives authentic spirituality as that which overcomes the self, the notion of spiritual empowerment as practiced through smartphones and social media appears not so spiritual. After all, such digital spirituality seeks to edify that which traditional mysticism seeks to throw into slavery, or, at least for al-Ghazali, subvert through a balanced equilibrium. The overcoming of the nafs, it should be said, is not tantamount to the absolute denial of the self or its subjective dispositions. Rather, it signifies the beginning of one's spiritual progression. As Khwaja Abdullah Ansari affirms in his treatise on the 100 way stations or maqamat, manazil as-sa'irin ila al-haq, developing self-awareness through the process of awakening, al-yaqadha, repentance, at-tawbah, self-accounting, al-muhasaba, penitence, al-inaba, and contemplation, at-tafakkur, to name the first 5 way stations in his schema, is a prerequisite for ascending to the stage of self-loss and ultimately to mystical union with God, fana. The first 5 way stations are part of the 10 called the preliminaries, al-bidayat. The ultimate goal is the annihilation of the self, but prior to this, an awareness of the self is indeed essential. The predicament of most forms of digital spirituality lies in the fact that they do not go beyond the stage of self-awareness. In such spirituality, self-awareness is the end, imbued with a quasi-mystical status, and not simply an early stage, a means to the mystical union with God. As a corollary of their egocentric nature, many of the objectives of these digital spiritualities remain within the scope of the immediate physical experience rather than the long-term transpersonal aims of tezkiyah and, ultimately, salvation. Here, the term physical applies not only to the body, but also to the mental faculties, since the nafs, a product of the contingent material world, can itself be thought of as physical, distinct from the ruh, authentically spiritual. As Karim Douglas Crowe succinctly put it, the psyche, or nafs, is sublimated matter, physical nature. These physical objectives of digital spirituality practically manifest, as it were, in the form of rituals and practices performed to achieve wealth and other tangible rewards in the pursuit of pleasure. More subtly, however, they also manifest in the attempts to induce altered states of consciousness, a practice now known on TikTok as reality shifting. Not unlike the trances induced by shamanic rituals and psychedelic drugs, reality shifting has gained traction in the virtual realm. On TikTok, shifters attempt ways to transcend mundane perception and mentally migrate to other realms, be they the astral plane of shamanic cosmology or even the settings of films and television shows. Like manifestation, reality shifting can take forms that seem limitless, an attribute of their postmodern context, wherein individuals become the sole arbiters of their spirituality and the means of cultivating it. However, shifting is always oriented toward a sensory arousal of some kind. The videos, for example, often have a filter of hallucination-esque multicolored flashing lights that are designed to evoke a mind-bending experience. They provide an illusion of transcendence, but merely tantalize the nafs. Curiously, several Islamic mystical theologians warned of the dangers posed by spiritual experiences that allure the mental and sensory faculties. They saw these experiences as deceptive because they engulf the individual in the illusion that they have transcended themselves and the world when they are merely experiencing an altered state of their own mind, which, being sublimated matter, remains corporeal and contingent. Another example can be found in the experiences attained through psychedelic drugs, which reality shifting seeks to emulate. In the New Age movement, especially in its 1960s countercultural context, the use of mind-altering intoxicants such as magic mushrooms and LSD was not uncommon. Under the influence, users felt they were transcending reality, when really the sensations that the drugs produced were no more than the projections of the mind and thus the nafs, albeit in an unrecognizable state, owing to the neurological disturbances caused by intoxication. A remarkably detailed account of quasi-spiritual experiences and their power to deceive comes to us from the renowned Andalusian mystic Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. His book of spiritual advice, or Kitab al-Nasaih, features a list of over 100 states, ahwal, that imbue the subject with a feeling or sensation that may resemble divine encounters or instances of tajalli, but are in fact purely mental and thus not to be relied upon. The list includes the increase in a subjective emotional state, hal, which doesn't produce spiritual knowing, the fresh inspiration, al-warid, that results from a disorder of the bodily constitution, every affection or love, mahabba, which doesn't cause the lover, the subject, to prefer the intention of the beloved, God, over his own intention, and the state of ecstasy, wedged, which occurs as a result of trying to achieve ecstasy, tawajud. Ibn Arabi invokes the concept of ightirar, or deception, to encompass the illusory quality of these experiences, which many forms of digital spirituality resemble. One is the state in which the subject is drawn to prefer his own intention over that of God corresponds perfectly to the objectives of manifestation in digital spirituality that invert the Islamic ideal of the intention or niyyah. Another is that Ibn Arabi's comments on altered states of consciousness sought for their own sake are those born out of the disorder of the bodily constitution, apply to reality shifting on TikTok, which, despite appearing less worldly than manifestation, being oriented towards seemingly metaphysical realms rather than material rewards, is nonetheless mental and therefore mundane. Both practices, manifestation and reality shifting, fall into this category, tantalizing the nafs in a way that is characteristic not only of modernity and specifically modern spirituality, but also of the nature of technology itself. Encoded in the interfaces of smartphones is the capacity to ontologically extend the very lower self that traditional Islamic spirituality seeks to overcome. In 1990, the sociologist Thomas Luckman remarked that the span of transcendence is shrinking. Since then, it seems the parameters of the mystical or the magical have continued to shrink, at least where privatized, digitized spiritualities are concerned. Yet, this trajectory may not necessarily be fixed. It could be that, in other ways that have yet to be explored, technology could offer a means to re-enchant, though perhaps not in the way that the early pioneers of cyberspace envisioned. Thank you for listening to Transcendence and TikTok, an essay by Esmé Partridge. You can find this essay online at renovatio.zaytuna.edu.